cold December morning. A routine Ryanair flight making its final descent into London Stansted. Cleared for the approach, but moments before landing, something went wrong. Pilots executed a go-around. One ground setting triggered a terrifying chain of events. The aircraft starts plunging towards the ground. Only seconds left before impact. The crew struggles to understand what's really happening. What went wrong in the cockpit of Ryanair Flight 1269? Let's find out.
Mayday, mayday, mayday.
Wind shear.
Terrain ahead. Pull up.
December 4th, 2023. Ryanair, an Irish low-cost carrier, was scheduled to fly from London Stansted Airport to Klagenfurt Airport in Austria and back to London Stansted again. The aircraft landed from London without any events. The aircraft involved was a Boeing 737 MAX-8 registered Echo India Hotel Echo Tango. Flight crew prepared the aircraft for its flight back to London. Flight 1269 comprised of 2 pilots, 2 cabin crews and 122 passengers. Once the preparation got completed, the aircraft taxied towards the runway as usual and took off in a westerly direction towards London. The climb and the cruise was uneventful. The captain of this flight was a 46-year-old, about 5,300 hours total experience, out of which he had about 2,800 hours on Boeing 737 models. From the report, we don't have any information about the experience of the first officer. Before we go ahead with the story, we need to understand a couple of things related to descent and energy management of the aircraft. Before starting descent, every pilot does a mental calculation of when they will start their descent for landing, meaning how much distance from the destination runway they need to start their descent. In aviation, the unit to measure distance is nautical miles. 1 nautical miles is roughly about 1.852 kilometers, just for reference. To calculate this distance, when pilots need to start their descent, we use a simple calculation. The calculation is altitude to lose divided by 1000 multiplied by 3. For every 1000 feet altitude loss, the aircraft will travel 3 nautical miles in the forward direction. If, for example, aircraft is cruising at 35,000 feet and the elevation of destination airport is 1000 feet, then the aircraft needs to lose 34,000 feet altitude. 34,000 divided by 1000 multiplied by 3. 102 nautical mile will be the distance required to descend from 35,000 feet to the runway. This calculation is based on nil wind conditions, meaning if you have headwind or tailwind, then you will need to modify this calculation again. For every 10 knots of headwind, we reduce this distance by 1 nautical mile. For every 10 knots of tailwind, we increase this distance by 1 nautical mile. If you have 50 knots headwind, then the new distance required becomes 102 minus 5, which equals to 97 nautical miles. This is one of the ways pilots plan their descent for arrival. The second thing I want to talk about is energy management. When we get closer to the airport, we need the aircraft in a certain configuration, meaning at a certain flap and gear setting, with the aircraft flying at a certain airspeed. You can't be flying at 300 knots at 5,000 feet just near the airport. You don't want to be too high on the approach or too fast or have incorrect configuration of the aircraft. Example, if the aircraft is 30 nautical miles from the runway, ideally it should be around 9,000 feet altitude. But if the aircraft is at 12,000 feet, then we say that the aircraft is high on the approach. If the speed is too high for the phase of the flight, it means you are hot on the approach. The way to manage aircraft's potential energy, which is altitude, and kinetic energy, which is airspeed, is basically called energy management. To manage 737's energy, these are of values we need to remember, which will help us in the story of Flight 1269. Below 10,000 feet, the airplane can be at a maximum speed of 250 knots. About 25 nautical miles from the airport, airspeed of about 220 knots. 15 to 20 nautical miles from the airport, airspeed of 180 knots with at least flaps 5 extended. 10 to 12 nautical miles from the airport, airspeed of between 180 to 160 knots. 7 to 8 nautical miles from the airport, airspeed of 160 knots with landing gear extended and flaps in 15. 5 nautical miles from the airport, with landing airspeed of what we call approach speed and flaps in landing configuration, flaps 30 or flaps 40 for Boeing 737. back to the story. The weather read as follows. It is info November, winds 130, 12 knots, visibility more than 10 kilometers, overcast clouds at 400 feet, temperature 6, dew point 5, QNH 997. The weather was generally good, but just the ceiling was a bit low. Not too low to be concerned about. The captain then briefed for Cat 1 ILS approach into Stansted, and further they started their descent. The initial part of descent was uneventful. The aircraft passing flight level 086, which is about 8,600 feet above the mean sea level, at 235 knots was transferred to Stansted approach frequency. ATC further told them to descend to 6,000 feet and told them that they had 24 track miles to the runway. By track mile here it means distance remaining to the runway. At this point they were just a bit high on the approach, which was easily manageable. A minute later, ATC cleared them down to 4,000 feet and advised that they had 20 nautical miles to the runway left. Aircraft were passing flight level 076 with 235 knots. They were high and a bit fast, but it was still manageable. Whenever pilot gets high on the approach, the ATC knows it and tries to help them by giving them more distance or track miles to the runway. In flight 1269's case, ATC did the same by turning them away from the runway, giving them extra nautical miles or extra distance to manage their descent. Pilots can also ask ATC for extra track miles if they feel so. There is no shame or harm in doing that. As they approached closer to the runway, the captain extended the speed brakes to get more drag and descend down quickly. Around 15 nautical miles from the runway, ATC cleared them down to 2,000 feet and cleared them to intercept the localizer for ILS runway 22. The aircraft was passing 6,000 feet at this moment. They were still high, a bit too fast, but still it was manageable. The captain armed the localizer and at 12 nautical miles from the runway asked for flaps 1 to reduce the airspeed with speed brakes extended. Ideally, they should have been with flaps 5 and speed under control. The pilots were hot and high on this approach and were kind of starting to get behind the airplane. The last thing a pilot wants is to be hot and high on the approach. They could have asked ATC for more track miles to the runway, because that would have been the safest bet, but since they were starting to get behind the airplane, the task in hand was getting too much for the pilots. ATC then asked them to reduce speed to 180 knots, which the captain did by asking for flaps 5. As they passed 3,900 feet altitude, localizer was captured when they were about 9 nautical miles from the runway with flaps 5 and speed of 195 knots. This moment, the glide slope indication was showing full-scale deflection down, meaning that they were way too high on the approach and they needed to get down immediately to capture the glide slope. Captain asked for flaps 10 to increase drag and get down quickly. At 7 nautical miles from the runway, already high on the approach and with the speed also high, ATC asked them to maintain 165 knots until 4 nautical miles from the runway and told them to contact Stansted tower frequency. With glide slopes showing full deflection down, speed high, gear not selected down, change to tower frequency, and ATC's request to maintain 165 knots until 4 nautical miles. Both the pilot's workload was very high at this moment. This was a perfect recipe to discontinue the approach and come back again for another landing. The crew then selected landing gear down and extended the flaps to 15 degrees as they passed 6 nautical miles from the runway at about 2,700 feet altitude with a speed of 186 knots. Few seconds later, they received their landing clearance. Soon the captain realized if they continued this approach, a safe landing would not be possible. So he said, if we don't catch it, meaning the glide slope, we will have to go around. As they approached 2,000 feet, they selected the flaps to 25 and the airplane soon started to level off at 2,000 feet. With the glide slope still not captured and the airplane about to level off at 2,000 feet, the captain set the MCP altitude to 100 feet and selected level change in a final attempt to capture the glide slope. This was not as per any procedure prescribed in the manuals of Boeing 737. Finally, the captain realized that they cannot continue with this approach and elected to go around. The first officer advised ATC of the go around and ATC said, follow standard missed approach procedure. As the captain pushed the toga switches for the go-round, the autopilot disconnected as expected. He took manual control of the aircraft, raised the nose to 15 degrees, and the auto throttles pushed the thrust levers forward towards go-round thrust. They first selected flaps to 15 and the landing gear lever to up. As they were passing through 2700 feet altitude, the first officer selected flaps to 5 with the airspeed increasing. Everything was going perfectly now, except for one thing. The altitude in the MCP window was still set to 100 feet. It actually should have been set to 3000 feet, which was the missed approach altitude for runway 22. In haste to go around after an unstabilized approach, none of the pilots unfortunately saw that the altitude was incorrectly set. Captain was busy following the flight directors, expecting that they will tell him when to level off the airplane. Since the MCP was not set to 3000, the flight directors just showed a climb command. As they busted to 3000 feet and kept climbing at 3400 feet, ATC noticed and said, "Maintain 3000 feet please, 3000. The first officer replied, "Maintaining 3000 will go." Captain, a little startled as they busted the altitude, started to pitch the nose of the aircraft down in order to descend the airplane again. He pushed the control column forward, trimmed the airplane nose down. The hot throttles were still engaged, providing go-around thrust, with the airplane pitch coming down, which led to the airspeed increasing. Soon the captain realized their mistake and saw the altitude, which was still set to 100 feet. So he immediately set the altitude to 5600 feet. The captain wasn't supposed to do this, as he was flying the airplane himself. He should have told the first officer to set it for him. With the airspeed approaching to 35 knots, the co-pilot noticed it and said, "Watch yourself, speed, speed." Captain reacted by extending the speed brakes, moving the thrust lever towards idle. Since the auto throttles were still engaged, they pushed the thrust levers again forward towards go-around thrust. The captain again pulled them back, and the auto throttle again pushed them forwards. Finally, they were held to idle by the first officer. A normal go-around now was turning into a messed up situation for both the pilots. The pitch started to reduce further down and kept reducing below the horizon. The airplane stopped climbing and started to descend. But due to the thrust levers being kept at idle, with nose down input on the control column, with nose down elevator trim close to 2.1 units nose down, speed brakes extended, all lead to a rapid descent of the aircraft. Rather than descending at a shallow rate, it started to descend at close to 8,800 feet per minute. The pitch of the aircraft kept reducing, and it came down to 17.17 degrees nose down. The speed increased dangerously to 295 knots. The nose down trim input by the captain set the trim to 2.1 units nose down, which contributed further to the nose of the aircraft going down. One wrong setting led to this soon to become a catastrophic situation. The aircraft was plunging towards the ground. The passengers saw the horrifying situation through their windows. The pilots needed to react fast and get the airplane out of this miserable situation. Finally, the captain realized the gravity of the situation and started to pull the nose up of the aircraft. Soon the aircraft's alarm started blaring.
Sink rate. Terrain. Pull up.
As he pulled the aircraft nose up, a vertical G-factor load of 1.9 G was felt in the airplane. The passengers felt pushing inside their seats. Soon the airplane started climbing again at an altitude of just 1740 feet above the ground. They climbed back to 3000 feet, engaged the autopilot, retracted the flaps, and stabilized the aircraft. The crew did a second approach onto ILS runway 22 and landed safely after this horror that they just witnessed minutes back. Captain said later that he had a perception that they were not high on the approach. First officer did feel that they were actually high on the approach. Both the captain and the first officer were not on the same page during the approach. Setting 100 feet on MCP was against the procedure when trying to capture glide slope from above, which eventually led to the confusion after the go-around. During go-around, Captain got fixated on the flight directors, thinking that missed approach altitude of 3000 was already set. When they busted 3000 feet altitude and Captain realized, he got a bit startled from it. Captain and the first officer did a lot of go-rounds in the simulator during regular training sessions. But this go-round for the captain was his first as a pilot flying on a real airplane. The other 2 go-rounds that he did on a real airplane was as a pilot monitoring. The investigators thought of a possibility of cinematographic illusion because this incident happened in IMC conditions with no visual reference outside. Example of cinematographic illusion is when the airplane is in IMC conditions without any visual reference outside and the aircraft accelerates like when doing on a go-round. Then sudden acceleration in the inner ear gives a false sense of pitch up of the aircraft, which leads to the pilot pushing the nose down way too much, which unfortunately happened in the case of Flyaway Flight 981. Pilots are trained and told to trust their instruments, not trust what their body or mind is telling them. In Ryanair 1269's case, they ruled out the possibility of cinematographic illusion because the captain did not push the nose down because of it. He did it because they busted the altitude of 3000 feet and he got startled by it. Ryanair later came up with a procedure for discontinued approach to help pilots with the procedure to do when they can't capture glide slope from above and they just want to go around. That wraps up our look at the Ryanair Flight 1269's incident. The end of the story ended positively. Mistakes can be made by anyone. We should never blame anyone for their mistakes. We should learn from it and move ahead in aviation. Thank you for watching.